like and subscribe. I am an extremely inquisitive and sociable person. But most of all in life, I like to listen to scary and mysterious stories from eyewitnesses. I find such people through the internet and ads in newspapers. For good and interesting stories, I pay live money, and therefore there is no end to those who want to talk with me. But, having met another eyewitness, from the first minutes of the conversation I understand whether the person is telling the truth or invented everything just to make money. I immediately point out the door to obvious deceivers, and, unfortunately, such are the vast majority. Let's just say, out of 100, 99 lie, and only one gets my attention. And from here it turns out that the truth is like a grain of gold in a huge pile of sand. People are deceivers by nature, but I don't blame them at all, because sometimes I myself like to lie and mislead others. However, when it comes to money, sorry, everything must meet the highest standards. I haven't paid anyone for outright lies yet. Lie for free, but for money, sorry, it won't work. But let's get down to business and listen to one story that at first seemed to me a complete fabrication. At first, I even wanted to interrupt the narrator and politely say goodbye to her, but my inner instinct told me not to do this. So I listened carefully to this woman to the end, and now it's your turn to listen to her. My name is Elena Stepanovna. I have been living in the city of N for almost 35 years. When I was young, I often went to the village where my grandparents lived. I have always loved nature, and therefore such trips gave me great pleasure. Basically, I tried to travel closer to autumn in order to pick berries and mushrooms in the forest. In my youth, this was my hobby, and even now I will not refuse to go into the forest for anything. At that time, when a bad meeting in the forest happened, I was 22 years old. As soon as I arrived in the village, the next day I immediately went to the forest thicket to pick berries. Thicket, of course, loudly. I kept more and more near the paths, but there, as a sin, there were almost no berries. Then I began to go deeper into the forest, and the long-awaited fruits on the bushes began to come across more and more often. Not more than an hour passed, and an almost full bucket was collected. I looked at my prey, and my soul sang joyfully. It's time to go back to the village. I went through the woods and suddenly saw, to my indescribable surprise, that a little thin girl was sitting under one of the bushes. She looked no more than 8 years old. I was unspeakably frightened by such a sight, a small child in the forest, alone. I walked over to the girl and looked at her closely. She was dressed in an old dress, and over it there was a woolen sleeveless jacket moth-eaten in many places. The child's legs were protected by earth-stained light stockings with holes in them and dark gray shapeless boots. The hair on his head was covered with a handkerchief, resembling a dirty rag. The whole appearance of the girl spoke of extreme need, and pity stirred in my heart. "Are you lost in the forest?" I asked, going up to the child and stopping literally a step away from him. But the girl did not respond to my question. She looked at me, and at the same time it seemed that the baby was looking through me. My attempts to talk the child continued for several minutes, but the girl seemed to be paralyzed. She seemed completely detached, but at some point her eyes took on a meaningful expression, and the words flew from her lips, "Yes, I'm lost." The little girl very easily jumped to her feet and grabbed my arm with force. I shuddered in surprise, and I even had a desire to push the strange girl away. But immediately ashamed of this spiritual impulse, I thought that the child was terribly frightened and therefore behaved accordingly. The girl should have been taken home immediately or handed over to the local authorities. I took the baby beside me, and we soon left the forest. "Do you live in this village?" I asked as we approached the houses on the outskirts of the village. The girl nodded her head affirmatively. Who do you live with? With mother and father. They are probably angry now because I was not at home for a long time and will be punished, the child replied. I tried to assure that no one would punish her. On the contrary, everyone will be very happy because she was finally found and came home. This whole situation with a walk in the woods and with angry parents seemed extremely strange to me. I asked with whom the girl went to the forest. She replied that she went with Dad, but then he took it and ran away. It looked even stranger, if not wild. I thought that I would need to ask my grandparents about this family in more detail. We had walked long enough along the main village road when the girl let go of my hand and stopped. Come? I asked and looked at the nearest old, but rather well-preserved and outwardly quite decent wooden house. The child nodded his head in agreement. I knew this house. There lived an elderly couple, husband and wife. But that some small children lived with them, I have never heard of this. However, relatives could come to them and bring this girl with them. And the little girl, as if nothing had happened, ran up to the gate, opened it and disappeared into the yard. I had no choice but to move on. But it should be noted that I completely calmed down. Still, she brought the lost child to the place, and, therefore, honorably fulfilled her human duty. Arriving home and showing off the berries, I told my grandparents about a strange girl I met in the forest. They listened to me attentively, but at the same time they looked somehow strange. After my story, my grandmother noticed that the elderly couple had no relatives to whom the girl went. There was a very long time ago the only daughter, but she drowned in the river at the age of 7 years. Since those tragic events, these people have been living alone and no one has ever visited them. But maybe the baby just made a mistake at home. But the most important thing is that she ended up in the village, and here she will not disappear among the people. And the next morning the news reached us that the man from the house, which the girl indicated as her own, had died. His wife was left all alone, and the whole family went to her to express condolences. When they crossed the threshold, they saw the hostess, crying from grief. I, of course, looked around, looking through the eyes of a small child, but there was no one in the hut except the hostess herself. It seemed to me that it would be good to distract the heartbroken woman for a while, and I asked about the little girl whom I met a day ago in the forest. Hearing my question, the hostess stopped crying, looked at me in surprise, and said that not a single child had crossed the threshold of this hut for many years. Feeling embarrassed, I hid behind my grandparents and took one more look around the room. I saw an old photograph on the sideboard. She came, looked, and gasped. It depicted a young married couple, and between them sat the same girl whom I happened to meet yesterday in the forest. It was no longer up to decency, and I again turned to the hostess, demanding in a voice asking who was depicted in the photograph. She replied that she and her husband and daughter were photographed many years ago. Everyone present looked at me with condemnation. And indeed, a person has such grief, and then some visiting young woman asks absolutely inappropriate questions. I had to shut up and ask no more questions. But when I came home with my grandparents, I told them about the amazing similarity between the girl in the photo and that little girl from the forest. Relatives listened to me and crossed themselves superstitiously. They were silent, and grandfather suddenly said it was the daughter of her father who took her to the grave. But it is not known whether his turn has come or whether she came for him earlier. You should not, granddaughter, meet her in the forest. Be very careful now. A bad meeting in the forest and subsequent events had an extremely depressing effect on me. 2 days later I left for the city, and 6 months later my grandparents also moved to the city, and I didn't go to that village again. And the wife from the ill-fated house briefly outlived her husband. She died after his funeral 3 months later. And they say that they saw a little unfamiliar girl in the courtyard of the house the day before her death. Here is such a story, and it seems to me that I really talked with a dead child. When I think this, the hair on my head starts to move in horror. Don't forget like and subscribe.